Hi friends, this is your pal Scott Garibay, and today we are going to talk about Dungeons and Dragons, and we're going to talk about Dungeons and Dragons 3D VTT Sigil, which failed at the beginning of 2025. Very, very interesting. I want to kind of break this down. One of the things really interesting about this is uh, it's what's really fascinating about Dungeons and Dragons is a ton of things that happen on Dungeons and Dragons are truly historic and are a really big deal, but they don't often really get the attention they need because so much, or get the attention they deserve. And the reason why is they get so much. They get There's so much that's happening on Dungeons and Dragons that it's hard for the communities to really talk about what's occurring with Dungeons and Dragons and what is needed, right? Yeah. So it's very interesting, and I really find it fascinating. Um, I really, yeah. So I don't think this was talked about enough when it happened, but I totally understand why it didn't, because there were just other things happening. So one of the problems with Dungeons and Dragons history is it's hard to report on it for anyone because so much is happening and different parts of the community care about it in different ways. It's really, really unique. So what happened? All right, so basically they were building this 3D VTT, and a lot of people on the OSR and on the indie side were saying, "Hey, this is gonna revolutionize. Nobody will be playing Dungeons and Dragons the way we play today for long at all. This is just going to sweep the board, right? And there'll be a few people, using those clunky old books and and sitting around a table with their friends doing Dungeons and Dragons the way they've done it since 1974. It's going to be, transformed into this video game esque like experience." Well, they were all wrong, and I did want to just take a minute to say they were completely wrong, right? Like, and again, there's this problem with people are just like, nobody talks about when certain parts of the community are outrageously, ridiculously, just completely wrong. But I did want to say there were quite a few OSR and indie voices that were saying, "Oh yeah, D&D is about to be crushed by its own product, right? Like this 3D VTT Sigil is just going to clear the board, and Dungeons and Dragons is going to really convert into a video game esque experience." And I understand why they thought this. I knew this wasn't going to work, and you can see it on my channel. I had talked about it. I'm like, this is not going to be a big deal, right? And the reason why is I've seen pushes to. There's been a push to make D&D a video game for a long time, but I understand why they said what they said. And one of the reasons why they said what they said is is Baldur's Gate. Like, Baldur's Gate was extremely real. That was very real. Like, that was not nobody was imagining that. That was real, right? And what do I mean by that was real? Well, Baldur's Gate 3 made $1 billion in 2024. Like, it was huge. So there absolutely is a demand for Dungeons and Dragons stories in other formats. There's demand for Dungeons and Dragons formats in movies. There's demand for Dungeons and Dragons stories in novels, and there is demand for Dungeons and Dragons stories as video games. But this is the part that I think is very important to realize and to focus on, is none of those are Dungeons and Dragons. And I think the reason why is Dungeons and Dragons truly is a fundamental change in how humanity is interacting with narrative and identity. And nothing you experience in a book, nothing you experience in a show, nothing you experience in a movie, nothing you ever experience in a video game can or ever will equal it. There is just, and the reason why is the human brain. Like, we're getting AI right now, and it's getting better and better. But the reality is, there's nothing like a dungeon master. A dungeon master actually cares about you. A dungeon master is actually aware of you. A dungeon master can change the story at the raise of an eyebrow. And no other narrative form has anything like it. Dungeons and Dragons truly is the most powerful, narrative tool humanity has ever created. Now, granted, that is not recognized right now by humanity. Like, they think it's an elf game that we play in our basements, right? And they're wrong. It's just we haven't gotten the message out. It is starting to get out. There's some really wild things happening around Dungeons and Dragons, and the explosion of its intellectual property crossovers and many of these other things are proof that there really is something truly exceptional happening with D&D. But you know, the failure of the VTT is because the 1974 one DM, 5 humans around a table, telling stories interrupted by probability equally, both the Dungeon Master and the Dragon Masters. Nothing can touch that experience. It is, and nothing can copy it. Right? There really isn't anything like it. And I just talked about the narrative part. Right? We don't even understand the narrative part. And when people understand how narrative has been changed, has truly been changed by Dungeons and Dragons, then at that point you'll advance to the point where you're like, well, if it changed narrative this much, what can we do with the identity part? And I do think that humanity has to, at the macro level, embrace what it can do with narrative in order to unlock the power of what Dungeons and Dragons can do with identity. This is really, really new and fresh and unique, and I really believe we're at the beginning of this, and in a very unique and special space. Every single word you just heard in this video is my humble opinion. The important part is when I get to hear your humble opinion. When you get in the comments and send your traffic, please consider liking, subscribing, and have a fetch millennium.